Welcome back. Now, ANC Deputy President Paul Mashatile issued a stinging rebuke to Africa's liberation movements, urging them to confront the uncomfortable question, which was, are we still vehicles for justice or have we become platforms for status and convenience? This was the question that was posed by Paul Mashatile. This comes after he delivered an address at the ANC Liberation Movements Summit, where of course, he challenged former liberation parties, including Mozambique's Frelimo, beg your pardon, ZANU-PF from Zimbabwe, and other political parties from across the SADC and East African region. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome a professor in Unisa's Department of History, Professor Chitja Twala. Prof, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on this important topic.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Prof. Twala, where are we in terms of liberation movements? I ask this question because let's start here in South Africa. Last year's elections, the ANC dipped way below that 50% mark. And a lot of the questions were, are they still relevant? Do they still speak to the current needs of the people in this day?
No, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, the summit came at the right time, whereby the liberation movements are trying to redeem themselves and also to reflect on the past trajectory of liberation. But coming directly to your question, it is $1 million question to answer that what is that is being done by liberation movements when we look at South Africa with the ANC. In all elections on the SADC region, it is without any doubt that there is a dwindling of the voters in terms of voting for the liberation movements. And one can ascribe this dwindling of voters to many aspects. It is a multifaceted kind of approach. One, it is the question of aligning the whole idea of liberation with what is happening today. And because in the past, the liberation movements were geared to fighting for a liberation of the respective countries, including the decolonization of those countries. But today, the sketch is about neocolonialism and how should these liberation movements today position themselves to fight against neocolonialism. Secondly, in the past, the liberation movements were known as grassroots movements, whereby people who were on the grassroots will look up to them for survival and for freedom and liberation. But today, liberation movements are seen by many as a ticket to wealth. Therefore, there is that uncomfortability between the masses on the ground and the liberation movements, because they've tended to become elite movements for certain individuals and without dishing out service delivery to the needy, which is the grassroots masses.
Yeah, and that's where the next question I want to bring in, Prof. Twala, is when you look, let's take Zimbabwe, for example, and obviously when the ZANU-PF had overthrown the British government at the time in 1981, when the independence was reached, what we see then in the Zimbabwe we see now, of course, a country where unemployment is probably at its record, a Zimbabwean dollar that means absolutely nothing at this moment. And of course, when you listen to eyewitness accounts in Zimbabwe and human rights organizations there, it's become far worse now under the presidency of Emmerson Mnangagwa. And therein lies the trouble with liberation movements, isn't there? That on one side, they feel that because they were the ones that overthrew colonialism, or in South Africa's case, apartheid, that there's a sense of an owing that the citizens need to have towards the liberation movements. That's not the case, isn't it?
No, I don't think that is the case, because the problem is the whole question of entitlement from the liberation movements, that they liberated people. Therefore, they are using the liberation legacy or the liberation credentials to say we are still relevant even today. But the scope has totally changed. We can't use the very same slogan of 60 years ago and use it today. When you look at the question of liberation movements like ZANU-PF in Zim, for example, the whole question of corruption, the whole question of maladministration, the whole question of chronism, those are the issues that people are lamenting about. And if our liberation movement can go back to the drawing board and stop having lip service, but deal with issues and deal with these issues decisively, and the liberation movements can still be accommodated in our citizenry. But if they continue with this speed of not listening to the masses and not taking cue to what the masses are saying, of continuing with a high rate of unemployment, of continuing to have the masses without service delivery and services, the basic services, then that is going to be problematic. Because when they galvanized the support in the past, they said to the people, we are going to give you services, we are going to give you land, and we are going to give you water. And then the people are still looking for that even today. We must not at the same time use one brush to brush everybody and say these liberation movements failed to do 1, 2, 3. They attempted to do that, what the people are expecting, but it is not good enough. People are so impatient, and this is a time bomb that we are sitting on in terms of what people are looking for from these liberation movements.
Prof, and I think one of the criticisms that many people have spoken about is that when you look at the ANC, ZANU-PF, SWAPO of Namibia, FRELIMO of Mozambique, Chama Chama Pinduzi of Tanzania, is that within the higher echelons of these parties, of these liberation movements, there isn't enough youth. A lot of them sitting over 50. When you look at this when you look at the ANC's top 7, that is the case right now. A lot of it, sitting between maybe the 45, 50. Okay, Fikile and Mbalula is of course just bordering on 50 right now. Therein lies the issue, isn't it? When most of the populations of these countries are young people, and it's very difficult for, as they would say, an old dog to actually learn new tricks.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. But I would go for a blended kind of leadership. Because the very same youth, they will need the elders to guide them. But I fully agree that we need the youth to take the baton forward. And that has to do with succession planning. And liberation movements should be truthful to themselves and have honest discussions on the issue of succession. Not only looking at the youth, but looking at the youth also taking into consideration the whole question of gender. And that is important to us as the countries under the liberation movements who are now ruling parties. And that is important. If the liberation movements who are ruling parties today can take leave on that, I think they can still rekindle themselves in moving forward. All of them, they've got the youth leagues, all of them, they've got the women's league, but we don't see these youngsters graduating into powerful position of leadership. We've got only pockets of such that is in existence. But I think in all fairness, they can still do what is important and correct the wrongs of the past. And secondly, one other issue that we need to deal with, it is the whole question of the politics of the stomach. That people are so obsessed with themselves, and rather than be obsessed with the masses. And if we can correct that, I think we are going to move to a different direction. And another one, we looked at the dwindling electorate when coming to the votes, but we have never also questioned the election bodies and how genuine are the election bodies when they are overseeing these elections. Are they non-partisan? When we look at what happened in Mozambique in 2024, and those are the questions that we need to discuss and to be honest with one another when discussing such issues.
Prof. Twala, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Thank you very much. Always available.
That's Professor Chitja Twala, Unisa's Department of History, serves as a professor there. Well, that's all we have for you on News in Focus. Tomorrow, of course, will be a talking point. If you've missed this today's episode of News in Focus, you will find all the interviews on our YouTube channel. From myself, Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.